top professors mock a black student. Then he solves what they couldn't. "You must be joking," Dr. Whitman whispered to the professor beside him, loud enough for several students in the front row to hear. "They're letting anyone into advanced theoretical mathematics now, huh?" Across the lecture hall, all eyes began to shift, some subtly, others openly. At the center of their collective attention was a young black student seated in the third row, quiet, focused, notebook open, pen spinning between his fingers with unconscious precision. He wore a plain gray hoodie and simple jeans, no flashy tech or designer gear like most others in the class. His name was Malcolm Hayes. And everyone, especially the professors at the front of the room, had already decided he didn't belong. The room had fallen so silent you could hear the high heels of Dr. Karen Cartwright echo down the steps as she entered. Cartwright, head of the mathematics department at UC Berkeley, feared and revered in equal measure, was known for her ruthless intellect and her even sharper tongue. A woman who had destroyed more student egos than any midterm ever could. She walked to the whiteboard, picked up a marker, and without even greeting the class, began scribbling complex notation across the board. Malcolm followed her every stroke with his eyes. "We'll begin today with Laplace transforms," she said. "I expect you to keep up." "I'm not here to babysit anyone." Snickers fluttered through the rows, some directed at the complexity of the topic, others clearly aimed at Malcolm. One of them came from Daniel Klein, a smug senior seated to Malcolm's right. "Bet Cartwright's gonna chew this guy up by mid-semester," he muttered to his friend. Malcolm didn't respond. He'd heard worse, but then it happened. Cartwright wrote a long transformation on the board, paused, and turned toward the class. "Anyone care to explain the next step?" Silence. Not one student raised their hand. Even Klein looked confused. Cartwright raised an eyebrow, lips curling in satisfaction. No takers. "Are we all already lost?" Malcolm raised his hand. The room tensed. Cartwright's eyes flicked toward him with thinly veiled surprise. "Yes?" "There's a mistake in the coefficient," Malcolm said calmly. "The transform applied to that exponential function should yield a different term. If you continue from that, the final result will be off." Cartwright stared at him. Dead silence followed. Whitman scoffed, shaking his head. Another professor smirked. A few students craned their necks to get a better look at the board. Cartwright didn't move. Then, slowly, she turned to examine the problem she'd just written. 1 second, 2, 3. Then she turned back, her expression unreadable. "Is that so?" "Yes, ma'am," Malcolm replied without hesitation. A few students shifted in their seats, uncertain whether this was bravery or suicide. "Then," she said after a long pause, "perhaps you'd like to come up and show us." The trap had been sprung. Malcolm stood slowly, walked to the front, took the marker from her hand without hesitation. His fingers didn't tremble. No fear in his expression. He erased a single term, rewrote it properly, and continued the next step, adjusting the chain of logic in a way that immediately clarified the confusion for half the room. He capped the marker and stepped back. Cartwright stared at the board. She said nothing. Not a correction. Not a thank you. Not even an acknowledgement. Instead, she turned back to the class and said flatly, "Next." That moment would be talked about for days. Some thought she was furious. Others believed she was stunned. But all of them, students and professors alike, had one shared realization. The kid could actually think. Later that day, as the students funneled out, Daniel Klein bumped into Malcolm in the hallway. "Bold move back there," he said, his voice flat. "You memorized that from somewhere?" "No," Malcolm replied. "I understood it." Klein didn't have a comeback. That night, in the faculty lounge, Dr. Whitman and Dr. Cartwright sat across from each other in silence. "You gonna let that slide?" he asked. Cartwright sipped her coffee slowly. "Let what slide?" "Some freshman correcting you in front of your own class." She looked at him, her expression flat. "There's nothing to let slide. He was right." "That's not the point." "No," she said. "The point is, let's see if he's more than a one-hit wonder." Whitman smirked. "Or if he just got lucky." They both knew it wasn't luck, but neither of them was ready to admit what they'd felt in that classroom. It wasn't just that Malcolm had corrected a mistake, it was the way he did it. The clarity. The control, the confidence, the look in his eyes that didn't ask for permission to be right. Meanwhile, back in his dorm room, Malcolm sat at his desk reviewing problem sets, headphones in, completely unfazed. He'd been underestimated his whole life. This wasn't new. He had no desire to impress them, but that didn't mean he wasn't going to outwork them. And tomorrow, if another mistake showed up on that board, he'd correct it again. This was just the beginning. 3 days had passed since Malcolm corrected Dr. Cartwright in front of the entire lecture hall. And while no one spoke about it openly, the entire energy on campus had shifted. You could feel it in the way people glanced at him as he walked through the corridors, their stares lingering a little longer. Some were curious, others suspicious, and a few just plain uncomfortable. But Malcolm kept his head down. He wasn't there to be liked. He wasn't there to prove anything. He was there because numbers made sense, because math had no agenda, no prejudice. Either you were right or you weren't. The rest was noise. That didn't mean he wasn't aware of the whispers. Think he cheated somehow? No way Cartwright let that happen. But still, I mean, who is this guy? He's just another scholarship story. It won't last. Malcolm heard it all. He didn't need to respond. But not everyone was content to whisper behind his back. It was Friday afternoon when the next shot was fired. Dr. Cartwright had just wrapped up the lecture with a problem so dense most students couldn't even copy it down fast enough, let alone understand it. As she capped the marker, her gaze drifted to Malcolm's row. "Since Mr. Hayes seems to enjoy challenges," she said, her voice laced with that same cutting composure, "why don't you stay a few minutes after class? I'd like to discuss something." Students stirred. A few exchanged grins. Daniel Klein smirked like he'd just seen the opening punch of a prize fight. Malcolm didn't flinch. He nodded once. The room emptied out slowly, and Malcolm walked up to the front. Cartwright didn't say anything at first. She stood in front of the board, arms crossed, her gaze focused on the last equation, like it had personally betrayed her. "I'm assigning you something extra," she said finally, still not looking at him. "A problem that hasn't been solved yet. One that's been sitting in my department's files for over 6 years. He blinked. "Is it part of the curriculum?" "No," she said, eyes narrowing. "But it should be interesting for someone like you." Malcolm said nothing. She finally turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "If you really want to prove you belong here, this is how you do it." Her tone wasn't challenging. It was surgical. Malcolm stared at her for a long beat, then gave a small nod. "All right. Send it to me." "I already have," she said. "Check your inbox." And just like that, she turned away. By the time he returned to his dorm, the email was sitting at the top of his inbox. No subject line, just a PDF attachment labeled Conjecture, Ashekchi, Whitman, and Cartwright, 2016. The problem was brutal. It wasn't the kind of math you could Google or find in a textbook. It was exploratory, layered in conceptual folds. It involved a blend of number theory, partial differential equations, and a nested recursive function that twisted back on itself. Malcolm stared at it for an hour without writing a single thing. Then he closed his laptop and got up. He needed to clear his head. He walked through campus under the amber evening sky, stopping by the basketball courts where a few upperclassmen were playing. As he leaned against the fence, watching them move, cut, and shoot, he thought back to his father's voice, the one he barely heard anymore. "Pressure's just a mirror," his dad used to say. "All it does is show you what's already there." By the time Malcolm returned to his dorm, the fear had passed. The next morning he began. For the next 72 hours, he didn't leave his room except for the occasional shower or stretch. Empty coffee cups lined the window. His desk was buried in scribbled pages, the garbage can overflowing with half-solved logic trees and failed approaches. But each failure chipped away at the problem's mystery. By Sunday night, he found a breakthrough. It came during a moment of silence. No music, no distractions, just the ticking of the old analog clock on his desk. He froze, staring at one line of math for almost 5 full minutes. Then he started writing. By the time the sun rose Monday morning, he had a working solution. Not a full one, but it was close. That afternoon, Malcolm stepped into Cartwright's office with a folder in hand. She didn't look up from her monitor. "If you're here to say it was too hard, don't bother." "I didn't expect—" "I solved it," he interrupted, placing the folder on her desk. She finally looked up, eyes narrowing. Cartwright opened the folder, scanned the first page. Then the second. Her fingers stopped flipping on page 4. "You derived an alternate convergence path for the recursive series?" "Yes." She kept reading. At one point, she glanced up, just a flick of her eyes, but that flick was all Malcolm needed to know. She wasn't expecting this. She was expecting collapse, and now she had to confront a much more complicated equation: him. Cartwright set the folder down. Her face was composed, but her fingers were pressed together so tightly the tips turned white. "This isn't polished." "I didn't claim it was," Malcolm replied. "There are some gaps." "Then let's close them." She leaned back in her chair, her expression tight with something between admiration and caution. "You don't get points for showing off." "I'm not trying to impress you," Malcolm said, locking eyes with her. "I'm just doing the math." A long silence followed. Then Cartwright smiled. Not kindly, not warmly, just cold. "You might want to be careful. People like you who rise too fast tend to fall even faster." Malcolm stared at her, his voice steady. "Then I'll keep climbing." And without another word, he turned and walked out of her office, not noticing that in the hallway, Daniel Klein had heard the last sentence. And for the first time, Daniel wasn't smiling. The lecture hall buzzed louder than usual that morning. Whispers bounced off the high ceilings, traveling down the rows like wildfire. Students leaned in close, sharing the same story, all with different versions, but the same name. "Did you hear what Malcolm did?" Cartwright gave him the Whitman conjecture. He cracked it in 3 days. "No way." "That problem's been sitting unsolved for years. I heard one of the guest professors is reviewing his solution right now." At the front of the hall, Malcolm sat in his usual spot, 3rd row, aisle seat, hoodie half-zipped. While the room throbbed with speculation, he remained still, staring blankly at the board, pen resting in his palm. But inside, his thoughts were on fire. Because solving the conjecture hadn't been the end of the game, it had only drawn more eyes, and not all of them were curious. Some were watching with sharp intent. It didn't take long for him to learn how high the stakes had suddenly become. That afternoon, Malcolm was called into a closed-door meeting. Not with Cartwright. With the Dean of Mathematics. Dean Edwin Rosen was a quiet man, known more for his discretion than his presence. But when Malcolm stepped into the room, Rosen didn't waste time with pleasantries. He gestured toward a chair, then slid a folder across the desk. "Your work's making waves." Malcolm didn't answer. The Whitman conjecture has been floating around this department for nearly a decade. Multiple attempts, all failures, then you walk in, first year, transfer student, and you hand in a solution in 72 hours. Rosen opened the folder. Inside were copies of Malcolm's notes, neatly scanned and annotated. Someone had gone through them in detail. "The thing is, your proof isn't just accurate, it's elegant. Almost like you weren't solving it, but rewriting it." Malcolm leaned forward slightly, voice calm. "I saw a pattern. Once I noticed it, the rest came together." Rosen tilted his head, studying him. "And how'd you learn to see like that?" "Practice," Malcolm replied, "and necessity." There was a pause, long enough to feel heavy. Then Rosen leaned back, his voice dropping lower. "I need you to understand what's happening here. You've stepped into territory most people avoid. You've embarrassed a senior professor in front of her colleagues. Whether she admits it or not, Cartwright has influence, and influence doesn't like being humiliated." "I didn't come here to humiliate anyone," Malcolm said. "I came to learn." "And yet here we are," Rosen said, folding his hands. "The problem is, some faculty members don't think you solved this on your own." Malcolm froze. "They're not accusing you yet, but they're asking questions. Questions about where you're from, who you studied under, how a student with no mentorship managed to leapfrog a decade of work." "So I'm guilty of not having a legacy?" Malcolm asked flatly. Rosen didn't smile. "You're guilty of making the wrong people uncomfortable. Which, in this world, is enough to get you burned." A silence fell between them. Finally, Rosen pushed the folder back toward Malcolm. "I'm not here to threaten you. But I am telling you to be careful. The deeper you go, the more enemies you'll make, especially if you keep proving them wrong." Malcolm stood, calm but measured. "I didn't come here to win anyone over, just the math." He left the office with his heart pounding, but not from fear, from clarity. Because now, he understood the real equation. It was never about the math. It was about control. 2 days later, Cartwright announced an upcoming departmental showcase, an annual event where select students presented solutions to high-level theoretical problems in front of a faculty panel and visiting academics. This year, she had handpicked Malcolm. She called it an honor. He knew better. It was a trap. The showcase was a battlefield. It wasn't just about solving problems, it was about performance, endurance, public perception. In that room, even the smallest slip could be dissected by a room full of intellectual predators. And the problem Cartwright chose for him? An unsolved structure theorem in combinatorics so abstract, most doctoral candidates avoided it. But Malcolm didn't back down. The week leading up to the showcase was a blur of equations and sleepless nights. He skipped meals, skipped calls from his mother, who had no idea what he was carrying on his back. Brian, the only friend who stuck by him, tried to help but knew when to stay out of the way. "You good, man?" Brian asked one night, catching him in the library surrounded by scratch paper and coffee-stained textbooks. Malcolm didn't look up. "Almost." "You sure you want to go through with this?" Malcolm finally looked up. "I don't have a choice. They're not going to stop until I fold." Brian leaned against the table. "Then make them fold first." Friday came. The showcase auditorium was filled with a mix of faculty, visiting mathematicians, grad students, and a few undergrads who wanted to see the guy who had apparently shaken the entire department. Cartwright introduced him with a smile that didn't touch her eyes. "Our next presenter is Malcolm Hayes," she said. "A transfer student with a unique approach to problem solving. He'll be attempting a live solution to a problem that so far has eluded every known approach. She gestured toward the board, where a nightmare of symbols awaited. Malcolm walked up slowly, feeling the weight of every gaze. Some looked eager, others looked hungry. He picked up the marker, stared at the problem for 10 long seconds. Then he started to write. He didn't hesitate. His movements were fluid, not rushed. Intentional, as if he had seen this problem in a dream and had already solved it there. By the time he reached the midpoint of the solution, the room had gone quiet. Pin drop quiet. A professor in the back leaned forward. Another whispered something to their colleague. Even Cartwright had leaned forward in her seat, brows furrowed, not in condescension, but something dangerously close to worry. Malcolm reached the final step, then stopped. He didn't finish it. Instead, he capped the marker, turned to the room and said, "There's more than one way to reach this answer. But I chose this one because it's the path no one looked at. Sometimes the mistake isn't in the math, it's in the assumptions." And then he walked off stage. Silence stretched. Then a single clap, then another and another. Until the entire room was standing, not because they understood the solution, but because they knew they had just seen something real. Malcolm didn't smile. He didn't need to. He had already rewritten the equation. The Monday after the showcase, Malcolm stepped onto campus expecting to fade into the usual blur of hoodies and headphones, but the whispers hit him before he could cross the quad. That's him, right? He's the one who solved the unsolvable. I heard Cartwright's face turned pale. Malcolm didn't stop walking. His shoulders stayed squared, head held high, but the shift in how people looked at him was impossible to ignore. Not long ago, he'd been invisible, dismissed by professors, brushed past by peers. Now he was a name. And not everyone liked that. Back in the lecture hall, things were tense. Professor Cartwright didn't mention the showcase. She didn't congratulate him, didn't acknowledge the standing ovation. She walked into the room like nothing had changed. But everything had. As she scribbled equations on the board, her tone was sharper, her pace more punishing. She called on Malcolm 3 times during that lecture. Each time, it was a trick question disguised as a test. Each time, Malcolm answered without hesitation. And each time, a flicker of something tightened at the corners of her mouth. After class, as students filed out, Malcolm grabbed his bag and turned to leave. "Mr. Hayes," Cartwright said behind him. "A moment." He turned back, calm. "Yes, Professor?" Her voice was cool, even. "There's a research project being assembled under the joint initiative with Stanford. We're selecting candidates." He blinked. "You're inviting me?" A pause. "I'm extending an opportunity." Malcolm considered her tone. Polished, professional, but off, like it was scripted. "What's the catch?" Cartwright smiled thinly. "No catch. Just an elite circle of minds working on problems most students wouldn't even comprehend. You'd be working directly under my supervision." He tilted his head slightly. "Is this an opportunity or containment?" A silence settled between them like dust. "You're very talented, Malcolm," she said. "But talent, unshaped, can be dangerous. This is your chance to be guided." "Or controlled," he replied quietly. Cartwright didn't flinch. "Be careful how many bridges you burn. Some reputations don't get rebuilt." Malcolm met her gaze. "Some weren't built to hold me anyway." He walked out. That night, he sat in his dorm room, eyes locked on his notebook. Brian leaned on the doorframe, arms crossed. "You look like you're about to declare war." Malcolm tapped the edge of his pen against the page. "She wants me boxed in." "Why?" She doesn't want the story to grow legs. If I join her project, she gets to control what I work on, who sees my name, where the credit goes. Brian whistled low. So what's your move? Malcolm looked up. I'm gonna write something that can't be ignored. A week later, he submitted a draft of a paper titled Reframing the Boundary Conditions of Prime-Based Functional Collapse. It wasn't just technical, it was revolutionary. A piece so far ahead of its time that most of the department wouldn't even know what to do with it. He didn't send it to Cartwright. He sent it to Dr. Elena Vargas, an independent mathematician known for publishing papers that traditional academia refused to touch until 10 years later, when someone with a name confirmed them. 3 days later, she called. "Where did you learn to think like this?" she asked him. Malcolm was pacing his dorm floor. "It's just how I see patterns." She laughed softly. "No, I mean it. You've rewritten a theorem that people have been rephrasing for 50 years without actually challenging its base assumption." "I didn't challenge it. I disproved it." A pause. Then, "Would you consider presenting this at the International Mathematics Forum in March?" He stopped walking. "I thought that was for postdocs and tenured faculty." "It is. But this is something else. They need to see this." When word spread that Malcolm had been invited to speak at the IMF, the reaction wasn't just surprise. It was chaos. Whitaker, the senior professor who had chuckled when Malcolm first raised his hand in Cartwright's lecture, was quoted telling another faculty member, "If this kid presents internationally, it'll change everything. They'll start asking why he was ignored in the first place." He wasn't wrong. Cartwright called an emergency faculty meeting to review the legitimacy of Malcolm's work. In that meeting, she said, "It's not about race, it's about merit. But when merit bypasses protocol, it invites scrutiny." But scrutiny worked both ways. Because Elena Vargas had already published an endorsement of Malcolm's work in a peer-reviewed journal and attached her name to it, it was official. Too late to stop. And then came the moment that turned everything. An anonymous email leak revealed private messages between Cartwright and Whitaker. In them, Cartwright wrote, "We can't let him become the face of this department. One paper is fine, a platform is dangerous." And Whitaker replied, "He's good, but he's still just a kid from nowhere. He'll choke when it really matters." The emails hit the student forums like a hurricane. By morning, half the campus had read them. By noon, the dean's office had issued a formal investigation, and by evening, Cartwright was suspended pending review. Malcolm didn't celebrate. He sat in the back of the same lecture hall where everything began, watching students file in quietly. He wasn't a name anymore. He was a reckoning. The system didn't fall that day, but it cracked. And through that crack, the light finally started to pour in. 3 weeks before the International Mathematics Forum, Malcolm found himself standing under the sharp morning sun outside the Department of Mathematics, a letter in his hand. It wasn't just any letter. It was a formal request from the university board. Postpone your appearance at IMF. Citing concerns over departmental representation and ongoing investigations, the board was gently, yet unmistakably, telling him to sit this one out. Not because he wasn't ready, but because his success had made people uncomfortable. Malcolm folded the letter slowly, sliding it into his pocket. He wasn't angry, yet. But his jaw was tight, and when Brian caught up to him on the steps, he knew something was off. "They trying to pull you from the forum?" "Yeah," Malcolm said without looking at him. "They say the department's reputation is at stake." Brian scoffed. "You are the department's reputation right now." Malcolm nodded once, slow. Exactly what scares them. Inside Cartwright's old office, now occupied temporarily by Dr. Regina Shaw, an interim head brought in from the University of Chicago. Tension hung thick in the air. Shaw had been observing quietly since the fallout, taking notes, reviewing faculty conduct. Everyone knew she was here to clean house. She tapped her pen on the desk as Malcolm sat down across from her. "You've read the letter." "I have." "I'm not going to sugarcoat anything, Malcolm. This university is under pressure. From alumni, from donors, from within. You're a brilliant student, and your work deserves the platform. But politics..." He leaned forward. "I didn't ask for politics. I asked for a fair shot." "I know," she said, "but you're not naive enough to think politics can be separated from academia." Malcolm didn't blink. "If the board forces me to back down, I'll take it public." Shaw raised an eyebrow. "You're threatening the university?" "I'm stating a fact. You push me into a corner, I'll burn the walls down." For a long moment, Shaw said nothing. Then quietly, "That may be exactly what they need." Later that afternoon, an emergency faculty meeting was called. The room was packed. Professors, admin reps, even 2 journalists from the campus press. Shaw stood at the front, calm but firm. "Today we address the attempt to block Malcolm Hayes from presenting his research on the international stage," she began. Whitaker, seated near the middle, folded his arms tightly. "No one's saying the boy isn't gifted, but these forums require preparation, mentorship. He's had none." Shaw looked directly at him. "And whose fault is that?" Silence. "Let's be very clear," she continued. "What's at stake here is not just a paper, not just a name. It's whether this institution believes talent deserves recognition regardless of who it threatens." Whitaker stood, voice rising. "You're turning this into a witch hunt. You're making this about race." Shaw didn't flinch. "I'm making this about truth. And the truth is, Malcolm Hayes solved a problem none of you could. You laughed at him, doubted him, tried to erase him, and when he didn't disappear, you tried to silence him. The room fell dead quiet." Shaw turned toward Malcolm, standing now at the edge of the aisle. "Mr. Hayes, do you still intend to represent the university at IMF?" "I do." "Then the department will stand behind you." "Fully." The motion was seconded, then passed. Whitaker stormed out. But the fight wasn't over. That evening, Malcolm received a message from an anonymous faculty email. "You don't belong here. Keep pushing, and we'll make sure you regret it." He didn't reply. Instead, he forwarded it directly to Shaw, with one sentence. "This is what I've dealt with since day one." The next morning, the administration launched a formal harassment investigation. Several faculty members were questioned. Password logs were pulled. An entire history of discriminatory remarks, long swept under the rug, came to light. It wasn't just about Malcolm anymore. The rot was deeper. As news spread, students started talking. Protests formed. Signs went up around campus. "Let him speak. Support Malcolm. Truth doesn't need permission." For the first time in the university's long and proud history, students weren't rallying for better cafeteria food or tuition cuts. They were rallying for justice, demanding that the system be accountable to its own ideals. And right in the center of it all was Malcolm. Not by choice, but by necessity. He walked the quad that day surrounded not by silence, but by solidarity. And as he passed the lecture hall where it all began, a freshman tapped his shoulder shyly. "Hey, I just wanted to say thank you. You made me believe I could be here." Malcolm looked at him and smiled. Because in that moment, he realized something no award or forum could ever match. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was opening the door. The conference room at the International Mathematics Forum in New York was more like a pressure chamber than a place of academic exchange. Rows of elite professors from Ivy League schools filled the front seats, while behind them, rising stars and mathematical prodigies prepped nervously with their teams. Malcolm Hayes walked in alone. No entourage, no advisors. Just a calm, quiet presence that somehow shifted the atmosphere around him. His hoodie was replaced with a crisp navy blazer and black slacks. The same Malcolm, but now sharper. Battle-tested. Whispers followed him as he passed. That's the Michigan kid, right? He's the one who embarrassed half his department? I heard he exposed a flaw in a decade-old theorem. Malcolm ignored them all. He wasn't here to be seen. He was here to solve what no one else could. Across the room, Dr. Whitaker stood stiffly beside a group of representatives from Harvard and MIT. His smile was tight, rehearsed. He leaned toward one of the judges, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and an Oxford accent. He's not ready for this stage, Whitaker muttered. The judge raised an eyebrow. Is that your professional opinion or your pride talking? Whitaker didn't answer. The room quieted as the head organizer, Dr. Luis Morales, took the stage. This year's keynote challenge, he began, is not just an equation. It's a problem that's gone unsolved for over 20 years. Today, we invite anyone, student or professor, to attempt it. He gestured to the massive screen. Lines of symbols appeared. The room tensed. Malcolm studied it only briefly before walking calmly to the front, before anyone else had even moved. A hush rippled through the crowd. He didn't look back. He didn't ask for time. He just picked up the chalk. Behind him, Whitaker's face froze. No one had expected him to go first, and certainly not alone. From the first stroke, Malcolm's confidence was clear. His movements were clean, deliberate, and unshaken. He wasn't showing off. He wasn't rushing, but each line built on the last with clarity that made even senior mathematicians lean forward. Dr. Morales whispered, "My God, he's not testing ideas, he's solving." Two MIT students watching from the back murmured to each other. I tried that line last semester. Got stuck before line 4. He's 5 steps past that. Already? Malcolm paused, studied his last transformation, then underlined it lightly. A critical substitution. Heads turned. Phones snapped pictures. Dr. Regina Shaw, who had flown in that morning without telling anyone, stood in the far back, arms crossed, eyes glowing. Whitaker stepped toward Morales. He's going to mess up. You'll see. Morales didn't respond. His gaze was locked on the board. Malcolm was rewriting the rules of the problem. At minute 22, he stepped back, brushed the chalk dust from his hands, and returned to his seat. Silence. The screen still displayed the problem. His solution now covered half the board, unbroken. A few professors stood and began walking toward it, unable to resist. Morales addressed the room again, voice low but charged. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we need to confirm what we've just seen. 3 judges walked forward. They dissected each line. The room waited. One whispered. Then another. Then the third turned and spoke aloud. It's not just correct. It's elegant. The words hit like thunder. Applause erupted, the kind that doesn't wait for a cue. Students jumped to their feet. A Princeton professor clapped loudly, even shaking his head in disbelief. Journalists pushed closer to the stage. And Whitaker? He didn't move. He looked like a man sinking into his own shadow. Backstage, an interviewer caught up with Malcolm, mic in hand. You've just solved a problem that stumped some of the top minds in the world. How does it feel? Malcolm blinked slowly. It's not about how it feels. It's about what it means. What do you mean? It means we need to stop assuming brilliance only comes in one color, or wears a particular badge. The video clip would later go viral. But for now, in that moment, Malcolm simply stepped back into the hallway and breathed. alone, until a voice stopped him. Hayes, he turned. It was Dr. Whitaker. Face pale, eyes unreadable. I underestimated you, Whitaker said. You tried to erase me, Malcolm corrected. Whitaker didn't deny it. What you did today will be remembered. Malcolm tilted his head. I didn't come for memory. I came to build something better. Then he turned and walked away, leaving Whitaker alone with a silence louder than any applause. Outside, snow was starting to fall, but inside the forum, a storm had already come and gone, and Malcolm Hayes had stood at the center of it, unchallenged. Malcolm didn't expect the knock on his dorm door at 11:42 p.m. He was finishing a proof in his notebook, one that had nothing to do with the competition and everything to do with clearing his mind. The adrenaline hadn't worn off. The room still felt like it was pulsing with leftover applause. Another knock, firmer this time. He opened the door to find Professor Shaw standing in the hallway, hands in her coat pockets, face unreadable. May I come in? She asked. Malcolm stepped aside. She didn't sit, just scanned the room quickly. Books, equations on the wall, a stack of physics journals on the desk. You've been busy, she said. I stay busy. Shaw turned to face him. The committee has been talking. About the forum? He asked. About what happens next? Malcolm raised an eyebrow. Next? They want you to represent the U.S. at the World Mathematics Invitational this summer in Geneva, the youngest ever. He blinked. Not from surprise, but because finally someone had said it out loud, what his work meant, what it deserved. You're not surprised, she said. I'm not. A pause. Shaw crossed her arms. But not everyone's happy about it. He gave a dry laugh. Let me guess, Whitaker? Not just him. A few faculty members from Princeton, MIT, even Berkeley. They're calling it premature, saying you need more time, more guidance. Malcolm turned, walked back toward his desk, and sat. They want to put a leash on me. They want control. You've done everything outside their system. No advisor. No lab, just your own mind. And that scares them. Shaw nodded. Terrifies them. Malcolm leaned back in his chair. Let them be afraid. She smiled. Just a little. They're pushing for a closed faculty review, she said. They want to evaluate your work formally before the committee moves forward with the nomination. You mean a trial? She didn't argue. They're hoping they can find something. A flaw, a shortcut. A reason to say I'm not ready. Shaw's face grew more serious. And if they don't find one, they'll make one. Silence. Malcolm didn't flinch. Then let them. The next day it happened. He walked into a boardroom, not a classroom. No chalkboard. No equations on the wall. Just a long, polished table, 7 professors seated in a row like judges in an old courtroom. Whitaker sat at the center. Mr. Hayes, he began, voice low and rehearsed. This isn't disciplinary. This is procedural. We're here to review the methodology behind your recent work. Malcolm didn't respond. He just placed his notebook on the table. One of the professors cleared his throat. In your proof regarding the Laplace transformation variant, you diverged from the classical Euler step at line 14. Why? Because the classical method assumes uniform continuity. My method doesn't. The professor frowned. Another leaned forward. You cite no published source for the variable substitution on page 12. That's because no one's published it yet. I discovered it last month. Whitaker interjected, tapping his pen. Discovery requires validation, peer review, institutional rigor. And you think that happens in your offices? Malcolm asked calmly, A murmur passed through the boardroom. Whitaker leaned forward, voice sharp. This attitude, Mr. Hayes, is exactly why you need oversight. There are protocols, standards. No, Malcolm said evenly. There are walls, and I've already walked through them. Whitaker's face hardened. Then you leave us no choice. We will vote. A pause. Malcolm stood. You can vote however you want, he said. But it won't change what I've solved. It won't change the fact that your students are quoting my work, that your faculty can't refute it, that your journals will print it whether you approve or not. He picked up his notebook, turned to leave, then stopped. One more thing, he said, glancing over his shoulder. This system you protect, the one that failed to see me coming, it's not broken. It's doing exactly what it was designed to do. Whitaker narrowed his eyes. And what's that? Keep people like me out. Then Malcolm walked out. No notes. No fear. Only the echo of 7 stunned professors sitting in silence, and a storm already gathering beyond their reach. It was a Saturday morning when the decision came in. Malcolm was sitting in the quiet corner of a coffee shop just off campus, the same place he'd retreated to when the world felt too loud. The place hadn't changed, still smelled like dark roast and cinnamon, the same old barista who always gave him an extra shot without asking. But today, something was different. Today, everything was different. His phone buzzed once. Email from National Mathematical Committee. He opened it, read the first line. Congratulations, Malcolm Hayes. You've been unanimously selected to represent the United States at the World Mathematics Invitational in Geneva. He stared at the screen. No smile. No fist pump. Just a deep, slow breath. One he'd earned. The professors who once mocked him were now forced to sign off on his excellence. The same ones who doubted his place in the classroom now had their names at the bottom of a recommendation letter, bearing a seal they swore he'd never deserve. But this wasn't about Geneva. This was about every moment they tried to make him feel small, every time someone laughed at his hand raised in class, every "Are you lost?" look when he walked into honors seminars. Every office hour that turned into an interrogation. He hadn't just made it. He had changed the game. By the following Monday, the news had spread. His name was on the university homepage. Interviews were requested. Departments that had once ignored him now offered research fellowships. Students stopped him in the hallway to ask for mentorship. A group of high school kids even sent him a video thank you message. You made us believe we belong too. But not everyone was celebrating. In a closed faculty meeting, Professor Whitaker sat motionless as the dean read the committee's report aloud. It wasn't just praise, it was a dismantling. Malcolm's method wasn't just correct, it was revolutionary. His deviation from standard approaches opened new paths in nonlinear systems that had stumped postdocs for years. A junior professor raised his hand. Should we consider bringing him on as a teaching fellow? Whitaker's jaw clenched. He's still an undergrad. But he's teaching us things we've never seen. Silence. Even those who once sided with Whitaker knew it was over. Malcolm Hayes wasn't a fluke. He was the future. That afternoon, back in Cartwright Hall, Malcolm stood once again in the lecture room where it all began. This time, he wasn't there to attend class. He was the guest speaker for the department's honors colloquium. Professor Shaw introduced him with a calm smile. The student who reminded us what brilliance looks like when it's unfiltered. Please welcome Malcolm Hayes. The applause was loud, but Malcolm didn't soak it in. He stood at the podium, hands in his pockets, eyes sweeping the room. He saw faces, some proud, some ashamed, some still trying to make sense of what had happened. He started slow. When I first walked into this building, I was told, without words, that I didn't belong. Some of you laughed when I raised my hand. Others ignored me completely. I was underestimated not because of my work, but because of how I looked. A pause. The room leaned in. I didn't win because I'm better than anyone here. I won because I stopped waiting for someone to let me in. A few heads dropped. I wasn't supposed to succeed in your system, so I built my own. He reached into his backpack, pulled out a worn notebook, and held it up. This was my advisor. This was my mentor. And every time I flipped a page, I reminded myself, I'm not proving them wrong. I'm proving me right. Applause again, this time deeper. He finished softly. If you're watching this, if you've ever felt small, ignored, doubted, don't wait for the world to recognize you. Make it impossible for them not to. Afterward, students lined up to shake his hand. Some professors, too. Even those who once mocked him offered quiet nods, their silence a final admission. Outside, the air felt clearer, lighter. Malcolm walked away from Cartwright Hall without looking back. He didn't need to, because what he left behind wasn't just a memory, it was a shift. A crack in the wall, a new path for others to walk through. And to those watching this story unfold, remember, talent doesn't ask for permission. It speaks in action, not approval. And when brilliance meets purpose, there is no gate that can hold it back. If this story moved you, share it. If it made you think, let us know in the comments. And if you're ready for more stories like this, of strength, resilience, and truth, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on the bell. This is more than a story. It's a statement.